The small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, had never seen a woman quite like Sergeant Sarah Mitchell. She arrived at Fort Bridger on a gray morning in March 1945, her uniform crisp, her jaw set, and her eyes fixed straight ahead. The other soldiers at the base didn't know what to make of her. They had never trained with a female combat medic before, and they weren't sure they wanted to start now. Sarah had grown up in Millbrook, just 15 miles from the base. Her father had been a coal miner, tough as nails and twice as unforgiving. Her mother had died when Sarah was 12, and her father had raised her alone, treating her like another son rather than a daughter. He taught her to work with her hands, to speak her mind, and to never back down from a challenge. When war came and the military opened positions for women, Sarah saw her chance to prove something to herself and to everyone who had ever doubted her. But the men at Fort Bridger made it clear that she didn't belong. On her first day, Sarah reported to Captain James Rutherford, the commanding officer of her unit. He was a tall man with graying temples and a disposition that reminded her of her father, hard, skeptical, and closed off. He looked at her assignment papers with barely concealed irritation. "Sergeant Mitchell," he said, not bothering to stand. "I'll be honest with you, I don't believe women belong in combat situations. I don't care what the Army says. You're going to be a liability to my men, and I'm going to be watching you like a hawk to see if you prove me right." Sarah stood at attention. "Yes, sir, I understand, sir." "I doubt you do," he replied coldly. "Dismissed." That night, Sarah sat in her small room at the barracks, writing a letter to her father. She knew he would probably laugh when he read this part. Captain Rutherford reminded her so much of him, that stubborn belief that a woman's place was limited, that strength and capability were male virtues. She wanted to prove them both wrong. The weeks that followed were brutal. Sarah's squad members ignored her or openly mocked her. During medical training exercises, one soldier named Private Henderson deliberately spilled supplies when she was organizing them, then blamed her for the mess. Sergeant First Class Tom Barnes made comments loud enough for her to hear about how women cried when things got tough and shouldn't be trusted with lives. But Sarah said nothing. She worked harder than everyone else. She studied medical procedures until midnight. She beat the other soldiers in the morning runs, even though they made jokes about her needing to wear extra support to manage the physical exertion. She simply absorbed the insults and kept moving forward. Captain Rutherford watched her performance with what seemed like disappointment that she wasn't failing. He never praised her work, never acknowledged her skill, never treated her as anything other than a problem he had to tolerate. Then in May 1945, the war in Europe ended. The soldiers at Fort Bridger celebrated, but they also knew what was coming. The Army was reorganizing, and combat units would soon be shipping out to the Pacific. Everyone whispered about what that meant. The Japanese were still fighting, and the resistance was fierce. This wouldn't be occupation duty or cleanup work. This would be real combat, real danger, and real casualties. Sarah overheard Captain Rutherford speaking with Major Collins one afternoon. They were in the hallway outside the barracks, and she was doing inventory nearby. "I'm requesting that Mitchell be transferred out before we deploy," Rutherford said. "She's proven she can handle the training exercises, but a war zone is different. I won't have my unit compromised because I was too soft on her." Sarah's heart sank. She had worked so hard, sacrificed so much, and now she was going to be pushed aside, but she said nothing. She finished her inventory and went to bed angry. That night she received orders. She was being transferred, but not out of the military. She was being transferred to Japan. The Pacific War had ended in August 1945 with the atomic bombings and Japan's surrender. The military was establishing bases across Japan to maintain occupation and help with reconstruction efforts. Sarah was being assigned to a small military outpost near the rural town of Kawakami, about 60 kilometers from Tokyo. She tried to feel disappointed about the transfer, but she couldn't quite manage it. Part of her knew that this was her chance. Away from Captain Rutherford and Sergeant Barnes, away from the men who had made her time at Fort Bridger so difficult, she could start fresh. She could prove what she was really capable of. What Sarah didn't know was that Captain Rutherford had specifically requested to go to Kawakami with her unit. He wanted to see for himself whether she would fall apart when it really mattered. And he wanted to make sure his unit was never compromised by a woman who didn't belong. Sarah packed her belongings in early September 1945. The war was over, but the real test of her character was just beginning. She stood on the dock in San Francisco, watching the ships prepare to set sail, and she made a silent promise to herself. She would show them all, everyone who had ever doubted her, everyone who had underestimated her because of her gender, everyone who thought women were weak. She would show them what strength really looked like. She didn't know yet that her greatest strength wouldn't be her medical skills or her physical toughness. It would be her compassion. And that compassion would lead her into a conflict that would threaten her career, destroy her reputation, and ultimately force her to choose between following orders and doing what was right. The ship left San Francisco on a cold morning. Sarah stood on deck, watching America disappear into the horizon. Somewhere ahead of her, in a small Japanese town with a name she could barely pronounce, a group of hungry children waited. And she would meet them soon, in circumstances that would change the course of her life forever. The American military base near Kawakami was small, maybe 300 soldiers total, established more as a supply station than as a combat installation. The war was over, the fighting had stopped, and the base was intended to provide resources and oversight for the civilian population in the region as Japan began its long process of rebuilding. Sarah arrived in mid-September 1945. The air was warm and humid, thick with the smell of rain and earth. She was assigned to the medical tent, which was really just a converted warehouse with wooden tables serving as examination areas and a storage room full of supplies that seemed almost scandalously abundant compared to what she had heard about the shortages affecting the civilian population. Captain Rutherford had come to Japan with her, along with most of the unit. His first act was to establish a strict hierarchy at the base. Soldiers were not to fraternize with the local population. They were not to give supplies to civilians. They were not to make exceptions to protocols, no matter what. The rules were the rules, and rules kept order. Without order, there would be chaos. Sarah understood the logic of his position. Discipline was important in military life, but she also saw something else on her first day that made her question whether his rules were truly necessary. While walking with Nurse Lieutenant Catherine Walsh to the medical supply tent, Sarah noticed a group of children watching the base from beyond the fence. They were thin, almost skeletal, with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed too large for their faces. Their clothes were threadbare, patched in multiple places, and some of the younger children were barefoot despite the rough ground. "How long has it been like this?" Sarah asked Catherine. Catherine was a compassionate woman from Boston, about 10 years older than Sarah. She had seen the worst that combat could do to the human body, and nothing much shocked her anymore. But even she looked troubled. "Months," Catherine said quietly. "The bombing destroyed most of the crops around here, and the supply lines for food were disrupted during the fighting. The Japanese government has been struggling to distribute what little there is. These kids probably haven't had a real meal in months." "Doesn't the base send any relief supplies to the town?" Sarah asked. "We're supposed to maintain distance," Catherine said. "Captain Rutherford is very clear about that. Military supplies are for military personnel. If we start giving them away, we won't have enough for the troops." Sarah looked back at the children. One of them, a little girl maybe 7 years old, was holding the hand of a boy who looked no more than 4. The girl was watching the fence with an intensity that made Sarah's chest ache. "That doesn't seem right," Sarah said. Catherine shrugged, a gesture of resignation. "A lot of things don't seem right anymore. Welcome to occupied Japan, Sergeant." Over the next few weeks, Sarah settled into her routine at the base. She worked in the medical tent, treating soldiers for minor injuries and illnesses, and she helped Catherine manage the supplies. She kept her head down and didn't make any waves. She was still working to prove herself, and she didn't want to give Captain Rutherford any ammunition to use against her. But every day, the children came to the fence, and every day, Sarah felt worse about turning them away. It started in October. The weather was turning cooler, and the children looked even more desperate. Sarah had been working early one morning when she found Private Tommy and Dickott, one of the younger soldiers in the unit, sneaking supplies out of the medical tent. He had a bag of canned fruits and a tin of powdered milk hidden under his uniform. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked quietly. Tommy froze. He was only 19 from a farm in Iowa, and he had always seemed like a decent kid. He was terrified of being caught. "Please don't report me, Sergeant," he said. "My mom, she had a little brother who died during the Depression. He was hungry and nobody helped him. I can't watch these kids starve when we have food sitting here that we don't even eat." Sarah should have reported him. That was the rule. That was what she was supposed to do to maintain order and discipline and to keep her reputation intact. Instead, she helped him hide the supplies better so he wouldn't get caught. Be smart about this, she told him. Don't let anyone see you, and don't give away so much that it's noticed, understand? Tommy nodded, tears in his eyes. Thank you, Sergeant, thank you. After he left, Sarah sat down in the medical tent and asked herself what she was doing. She was breaking rules. She was risking her career, her reputation, everything she had worked so hard to build. And for what? A few cans of fruit and some powdered milk. It wouldn't solve the problem. These children would still be hungry tomorrow and the next day and the next day after that. But she couldn't unsee their faces. She couldn't pretend the hunger wasn't there. And she couldn't accept a rule that seemed fundamentally wrong. The next day, Sarah began her own careful, quiet operation. She didn't take supplies often, just enough that the small discrepancies wouldn't be noticed. A can of beans here, some powdered milk there, sometimes dried biscuits, occasionally some chocolate from the soldiers' ration packs. She worked with Tommy, and soon Private Henderson, who had once mocked her so cruelly, came to her quietly and asked if he could help too. "Why the change of heart?" Sarah asked him. Henderson looked ashamed. "I was wrong. About you, about a lot of things, and watching these kids. It made me think about my sister's kids back home. I couldn't look at myself in the mirror if I didn't try to help." Within weeks, a quiet network had formed. About 15 soldiers were carefully removing small amounts of food from the base supplies and passing them through the fence to the children. They were careful, methodical, and they rotated who did what so no single person would be suspected. The children's faces began to change. They still looked hungry, but they didn't look quite so desperate. The little girl who had been holding her brother's hand began to smile occasionally. Tommy said the townspeople had noticed too. There was more hope, more resilience in the community. Sarah felt like she was doing something that mattered, and she felt ashamed of herself for feeling like she was doing something that mattered by breaking rules. It couldn't last. Sooner or later, someone would notice. Sooner or later, Captain Rutherford would discover what they were doing, and when he did, everything would come crashing down. On November 12, 1945, Captain Rutherford conducted a surprise supply inventory. He had been suspicious for weeks. Small amounts of supplies were going missing, nothing dramatic enough to report immediately, but enough to be noticeable. He had wanted to catch whoever was responsible, and he had set a trap. He assigned a junior officer to watch the supply tent while maintaining detailed logs of every single item. And then he waited. It took 3 days. Sarah was the one who made the mistake. She had become complacent, comfortable in the routine, and she didn't notice that the supply tent was being monitored more carefully than usual. She went in during her break to grab some medical supplies. At least, that was what she told herself. She grabbed supplies, yes, but she also grabbed a tin of meat and some biscuits that had nothing to do with her medical duties. She was caught red-handed by the junior officer and immediately marched to Captain Rutherford's office. He was sitting at his desk, reviewing the inventory logs with barely concealed satisfaction. When he looked up at Sarah, there was something almost triumphant in his expression. He had suspected her from the start, and now he had the proof he needed. "Sergeant Mitchell," he said coldly, "do you have an explanation for this?" "Captain, Sarah started. "Silence," he commanded. "You are in direct violation of orders. You are stealing military supplies. You are undermining the discipline and structure of this unit. And frankly, I am not surprised. I have suspected from the beginning that you didn't have the character necessary to serve in a combat-adjacent position. This confirms it." Sarah wanted to defend herself. She wanted to explain about the children, about the hunger, about how the rules seemed unjust. But she could see in his face that he had already made his decision. Nothing, she said, would change his mind. "The supplies are being given to the civilian population," she said quietly. "The children in the town, they're starving, sir. We have more than enough, surely." "Surely nothing," Rutherford snapped. "Our mission is not to feed the Japanese population. Our mission is to maintain order and security in this region, and you have compromised both by encouraging other soldiers to participate in this charitable endeavor." Sarah's heart sank. She had been careful not to implicate the other soldiers, but she should have known that Rutherford would have discovered the full scope of the operation. "How many soldiers were involved?" he demanded. Sarah refused to answer. She stood silently, her jaw clenched. "Fine," Rutherford said. "I'll find out on my own, And here's what's going to happen, Sergeant. You are being formally charged with theft of military supplies and conduct unbecoming a soldier. There will be a court-martial, and I fully expect that the military will see fit to dishonorably discharge you. A dishonorable discharge. It was the worst possible outcome. It would follow her for the rest of her life. No civilian employer would hire her. Her reputation would be destroyed. Everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed to prove herself, would be erased by a single act of kindness. And the other soldiers, Sarah asked. Will face punishment appropriate to their involvement, Rutherford said. Though I suspect their punishments will be lighter than yours, given that you were the ringleader. This is what happens when you step out of line, Sergeant. This is what happens when you think you know better than your commanding officer. Sarah was escorted out of his office by military police. She was confined to the barracks, her duties suspended, her reputation destroyed. The news spread quickly through the base. Some soldiers looked at her with disappointment. Others looked at her with quiet respect. But most just avoided her eyes, not wanting to be associated with someone who was about to face court-martial. Tommy and Dicott came to see her that night, risking punishment just by speaking to her. I'm sorry, Sergeant, he said, tears running down his face. I'm so sorry, this is my fault, I started it. No, Sarah said. I made my choice. I knew the rules and I broke them anyway. That's on me. The townspeople know, Tommy said. The kids came to the fence today. When we didn't have anything to give them, they looked so confused, so lost. The little girl, the one who had started smiling again, she just stood there crying. They don't understand what happened to the nice American lady who gave them food. Sarah wanted to believe that her actions had mattered, that the food had made a real difference. But now it seemed like she had just made everything worse. She had helped the children for a few weeks, and now they would go back to being hungry, and they would be confused about why the help had stopped. The court-martial was scheduled for December 10, 1945. The case seemed straightforward to everyone involved. Sarah Mitchell had stolen military supplies. She had admitted to it. There were witnesses. The evidence was overwhelming. The only question was how severely she would be punished. But 3 days before the court-martial, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at the base. It was addressed to the commanding general of the occupation forces in Japan, and it was from the mayor of Kawakami. The mayor, an elderly man named Tanaka Yoshi, had written to describe what the American soldiers had done for his town. He had written about the children who had been starving, about the hope that had been restored to a community that had been devastated by war and hunger. He had written about how those acts of kindness had proven that not all victors were vengeful, that humanity could exist even between people from opposing nations. And he had written about Sergeant Sarah Mitchell specifically, calling her a woman of true courage and moral character. The American soldier who organized the distribution of food to our children risked everything to help us, the mayor had written. This action violated military rules, yes, but it was not wrong in any moral sense. In Japan, we have a concept called jiri, duty or responsibility, but we also understand that sometimes the highest duty is to help those who are suffering, regardless of the cost to ourselves. Sergeant Mitchell understood this. She acted with honor, even though it violated the regulations of her superiors. The letter arrived in the hands of General Douglas MacArthur's office, the supreme commander of the occupation forces. It was forwarded down through the chain of command and eventually reached the command structure at the base. Suddenly, a simple case of theft and misconduct became a matter of international relations. Captain Rutherford was furious. He immediately called another meeting with Sarah. This letter doesn't change the facts, he said coldly. You still violated orders, you still stole military supplies. I don't care what some Japanese mayor thinks. The military has rules and we follow them. Yes, sir, Sarah said quietly. She was beginning to understand that this was never really about the rules for Rutherford. It was about power. It was about his need to prove that his way was right, that discipline was more important than compassion, that structure mattered more than human suffering. But the general staff saw it differently. The occupation of Japan was delicate. The military wanted the Japanese people to see the Americans not as cruel conquerors, but as benevolent occupiers. A story about an American soldier who had sacrificed her career to help starving children was excellent propaganda. Better still was the fact that the mayor of a Japanese town was praising the American military for the moral character of one of its soldiers. The court-martial was postponed pending a review of the case. Sarah was still confined to the barracks, still suspended from duty, but now there was doubt in the minds of the officers who would ultimately decide her fate. 2 weeks before Christmas, Major Collins called Sarah into his office. Collins was a different kind of officer than Rutherford, more political, more aware of the larger implications of military actions. He offered Sarah a deal. "The General Staff has decided that a court-martial is not in the best interests of the occupation effort," Collins said. "However, Captain Rutherford is insisting on some form of punishment. We've reached a compromise. You will accept a formal reprimand and you will be transferred back to the United States for reassignment. You will keep your honorable discharge status and you will keep your rank of sergeant. But your career in the military is essentially over. You won't be promoted. You won't receive commendations. Your file will be marked with this incident for the rest of your service." It was a generous outcome compared to a dishonorable discharge, but it was still a punishment. Sarah would have to leave Japan. She would have to leave the base, the medical tent, and the children she had been helping. "What about the other soldiers who were involved?" she asked. "They're receiving lesser punishments," Collins said. "Reduction in rank for some, extra duty for others, and the supplies will continue to be distributed through official channels now. The general decided that the publicity from this letter was actually useful. We're going to establish a formal relief program for the civilians in the region. It will be called the Humanitarian Aid Program for Occupied Japan, and it will be a flagship initiative of the occupation." Sarah understood what had happened. The military had taken what she and the other soldiers had done in secret, in violation of orders, out of compassion, and they had made it official policy. It was the right outcome, but it felt hollow because she had to leave to make it happen. She had to be the one to sacrifice her future so that official policy could change. "I accept," she said quietly. "There's one more thing," Collins added. "Captain Rutherford has requested that he be transferred as well. He's saying that working with you has become untenable, that your moral weakness is undermining his ability to lead. We're approving his transfer back to the States. He leaves in 2 weeks." Sarah didn't say anything, but inside she felt something shift. Rutherford was losing. He had tried to destroy her, and instead he was the one being removed from the situation. The General Staff trusted her more than they trusted him, and whether he realized it or not, she had won. On her last day at the base, Tommy and Dicot and a dozen other soldiers who had helped distribute the food came to say goodbye. They thanked her for her courage. They told her that she had changed the way they understood service and sacrifice, and they told her that they would never forget what she had done. That afternoon, Sarah walked to the fence one last time. The children were there, waiting. The little girl she had remembered, her name was Akiko, Tommy had told her, ran to the fence. A local interpreter whom the base had hired helped her speak to Sarah. "You helped us," Akiko said in careful English that the interpreter had taught her. "You were kind. Will you come back?" Sarah felt her heart break. "I have to leave," she said, "but other American soldiers will help you now. It's going to be okay, I promise." She reached through the fence and touched Akiko's hand for a moment. Then she turned and walked back to the barracks to pack her belongings. She was being sent back to the United States with a reprimand in her file and a mark against her career. But she was leaving Japan knowing that she had made a real difference. The children would be fed. The town would receive aid. And the military's official policy had changed because of what she had done. She didn't know yet that the real story of her actions had not yet been told. She didn't know that a local Japanese newspaper had picked up the mayor's letter and written about it. She didn't know that the story would spread beyond Japan and eventually reach American newspapers. And she didn't know that when she arrived back in the United States, she would find herself at the center of a controversy that would finally, truly force everyone to understand what strength and courage really looked like. Sarah arrived in San Francisco on January 15, 1946. She was in uniform, her duffel bag over her shoulder, and she was expecting to be processed back into the military system quietly and efficiently. She was expecting to be assigned to some administrative role somewhere, to spend the rest of her military service behind a desk, and then to be discharged with minimal fanfare. She was not expecting the reporters. There were at least 20 of them waiting at the dock, with cameras and notepads and questions that came at her faster than she could process. "Sergeant Mitchell, is it true you risked your military career to feed starving Japanese children? How did it feel to defy your commanding officer to help the civilian population? What would you say to critics who claim you overstepped your authority?" Sarah was bewildered. She tried to make her way through the crowd, but they followed her into the processing center. The military officials at the dock looked almost as confused as she felt. It turned out that the story had blown up. A wire service reporter in Tokyo had picked up on the story of the mayor's letter and the sergeant who had been court-martialed for stealing supplies to feed hungry children. The reporter had written a sympathetic article about Sarah's actions. The article had been picked up by major newspapers across the country, and by the time Sarah arrived in San Francisco, she was famous. The headline in the San Francisco Chronicle read, "American Heroine, Soldier Sacrifices Career to Show Japanese Civilians the Face of American Compassion." The Los Angeles Times had run a feature about her. When orders conflicted with conscience, how one woman chose morality over military discipline. And the New York Times, in a carefully worded editorial, had praised the general staff for ultimately allowing the humanitarian aid program in Japan, even as it questioned how such an obvious moral imperative had required a scandal to implement it. The military decided to embrace the story. Sarah was suddenly no longer a cautionary tale of a soldier who had overstepped her authority. She was a symbol of American values, a woman who had shown that even in times of conflict and occupation, compassion could win out over rigid adherence to rules. She was invited to speak at events. She was asked to give interviews to magazines. She received letters from across the country, some praising her, some criticizing her for breaking orders, but most expressing gratitude and respect for what she had done. And back in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, something happened that Sarah never would have expected. Her father received a letter from the mayor of Kawakami. The mayor had learned where Sarah was from, and he wanted to write to her father to tell him about his daughter's character and courage. The letter, which was translated into English, described Sarah as a woman of exceptional moral fiber, a person who had understood that true service meant putting the welfare of others above personal advancement. Sarah's father, who had spent her entire life telling her that she was tough but not tough enough, that she was capable but not capable in the right ways, read that letter and wept. And then he called the local newspaper in Millbrook and told them his daughter's story. Within days, Sarah was being celebrated in her hometown. The local high school invited her to speak. The church asked her to give a testimony. The town council awarded her a ceremonial key to the city. And most importantly, Captain James Rutherford's reputation was destroyed. The military had initially tried to protect him, but as the story became more public, journalists started asking difficult questions about his leadership. How had a commanding officer allowed such a deplorable situation to develop where soldiers had to secretly steal supplies to feed starving children? Why had Rutherford insisted on punishment when the soldiers involved were trying to do the right thing? Why had the military needed a scandal to implement basic humanitarian aid to the civilian population? Articles began to appear questioning Rutherford's judgment. Military historians started to examine his service record and found a pattern of rigid, inflexible leadership that had often resulted in poor outcomes. Officers who had served under him came forward with their own stories of his unnecessary harshness and his inability to adapt to changing circumstances. Rutherford tried to defend himself, claiming that discipline was essential to military function and that Sarah had been insubordinate and needed to be corrected. But his arguments fell on deaf ears. The public wanted heroes, not rule followers. The public wanted compassion, not blind obedience. Within a year, Rutherford was quietly retired from the military. His pension was reduced. His opportunities for civilian employment in government or defense contracting dried up. His name became synonymous with the kind of inflexible, heartless military leadership that everyone agreed was counterproductive. Meanwhile, Sarah was offered opportunities. The military wanted her to stay on as a spokesperson for humanitarian efforts. Civilian organizations wanted her to speak at events and help raise funds for relief efforts. A book publisher approached her about writing a memoir. But Sarah did something unexpected. She turned down most of the offers. She accepted a position as a medical officer at a veterans hospital in Pennsylvania, close to her home. She worked there quietly, helping soldiers readjust to civilian life, treating their physical and emotional wounds, and living a life that was less public but, she felt, more meaningful than being a symbol or a celebrity. She did, however, accept one opportunity that mattered to her. She agreed to participate in a documentary film about the humanitarian aid program in Japan, and its origins in the actions of ordinary soldiers like her and Tommy and Dicot, and the others who had risked punishment to help people in need. In that documentary, filmed in 1948, Sarah spoke about the experience. She was not bitter about her treatment by Captain Rutherford. She was not triumphant about his downfall. She was simply honest about what she had done and why. "I was scared," she said to the camera. "I was scared of breaking the rules. I was scared of disappointing my commanding officer. I was scared of losing my career. But I was more scared of living with myself if I did nothing while children starved. That fear was bigger than all the other fears combined." The documentary was shown in theaters across the country. It became part of the military's official training materials about ethical leadership and the importance of compassion in military service. And it made Sarah's reputation permanent. She had started her military service as a woman who was mocked and underestimated. She had been scorned by her peers and dismissed by her commanding officer. She had been accused of being weak, unreliable, and unsuitable for serious military responsibility. And she had ended that chapter of her life as a woman whose name was synonymous with courage, moral clarity, and the highest ideals of American service. But the most powerful part of her journey was still to come. It would come years later, in a moment that Sarah never saw coming, and it would completely reframe everything that had happened. Akiko was now a 30-year-old woman, a teacher in Kawakami, married with 2 children of her own. She had never forgotten the American soldier who had shown kindness to her when she was starving as a child. She had followed Sarah's story as it became public. She had read the articles and seen the documentary, and she wanted to tell Sarah what had happened in the years since they had last seen each other. "Dear Sergeant Mitchell," the letter began, "I do not know if you remember me. I was a small girl when you helped my town. I held your hand at the fence on your last day before you left Japan. You told me that other American soldiers would help us, that it would be okay. I want you to know that you were right." Akiko described how the humanitarian aid program had transformed the town, how children had stopped starving, how the economy had begun to recover, how people had begun to rebuild their lives and their community. But more than that, she described how the experience had shaped her generation. The children who had received food from American soldiers, including Sarah, had grown up understanding that compassion could exist between enemies, that humanity could transcend nationality and ideology, that people could choose to do the right thing even when it cost them personally. "Because of what you did, Sergeant Mitchell, I became a teacher," Akiko wrote. "I teach children to think for themselves, to question unjust rules, and to show compassion to those who are suffering. I teach them your story, though I do not always use your name because I want them to understand that these acts of courage are possible for anyone who is willing to take the risk." Akiko also wrote about her own children. Her son was studying to be a journalist. Her daughter wanted to be a doctor. Both of them had grown up hearing stories about the American soldier who had risked everything to help people in need. Both of them had been inspired by her example. "You came to my country as a soldier in an occupying force," Akiko wrote. "But you left as a person who had helped plant seeds of hope and compassion. Those seeds have grown into a generation of people who believe that kindness matters, that morality matters, that standing up for what is right matters. And you made that possible." The letter ended with a question. "I am bringing my family to America for the first time next year. My husband wants to show our children where the American military bases are, where the occupation happened, so they can understand their history. But more than anything, I want to meet you again. I want my children to meet you. I want to thank you face to face. Is this possible?" Sarah read the letter 3 times. She wept each time, not from sadness, but from a profound sense of completeness. She had spent years wondering if what she had done had really mattered. She had wondered if the food she had given out, distributed in secret and at great risk, had made any lasting difference. Now she knew the answer. Her actions had mattered not just for the weeks when the children were receiving food. They had mattered because they had changed the way an entire community thought about compassion, about moral courage, and about the responsibility of people with power to help those without it. Akiko's family came to America in the summer of 1969. Sarah arranged a day off from the hospital, and she met them at a park near her home in Millbrook. When Akiko stepped out of the car, Sarah recognized her immediately. The hollow cheeks were gone. The desperate eyes had been replaced with a warm, intelligent gaze. But underneath the changes of time and growth, it was the same girl who had held her hand at the fence in Japan. They embraced and cried and spoke for hours, with Akiko's husband translating. Akiko's children, teenagers now, sat and listened to their mother and Sarah talk about that time in 1945, about the hunger, about the kindness, about how two people from different countries and different cultures had connected through a simple act of compassion. Sarah showed Akiko the documentary that had been made about the humanitarian aid program. Akiko watched herself, a 7-year-old girl eating American food in a documentary made in 1948, with tears streaming down her face. When the day ended and Akiko's family prepared to leave, Akiko gave Sarah a gift, a photograph. It was from that last day in 1945, taken by an unknown soldier. It showed Sarah at the fence with Akiko, Sarah's hand reaching through to touch the little girl's face. They were both smiling. The photograph somehow captured everything: the love, the hope, the defiance of unjust rules, the triumph of compassion over fear. "I want you to keep this," Akiko said. "I want you to remember that what you did mattered, not just to me but to generations. You changed the world, Sergeant Mitchell. You changed my world." After they left, Sarah sat in her apartment holding the photograph. She thought about Captain Rutherford and his rigid rules and his need for control. She thought about the doubt she had felt in her own mind about whether breaking the rules was the right thing to do. She thought about all the moments when it would have been easier to just follow orders, to just do what she was told, to just accept the system as it was. And she understood, finally and completely, what true strength looked like. True strength was not found in weapons or in military rank or in the ability to command others. True strength was found in the willingness to stand alone when necessary, to break rules that were unjust, to sacrifice your own advancement for the welfare of others, and to do all of this knowing that you might lose everything. True strength was loving the people you were supposed to hate. True strength was showing compassion to those who had been your nation's enemy. True strength was understanding that your responsibility to humanity was bigger than your responsibility to any organization or any chain of command. In her final years of service before retirement, Sarah became quietly famous in military circles as someone who had changed the way the military thought about humanitarian action and moral leadership. Officers studied her case in ethics courses. Her decisions were analyzed and debated and ultimately upheld as examples of moral courage in a complex situation. But Sarah never sought recognition. She continued her quiet work at the Veterans Hospital. She helped soldiers heal. She lived a simple life in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, the same town where she had grown up with a father who had taught her to be tough, but who had not taught her how to be kind. And every year on the anniversary of her last day in Japan, she took out the photograph of herself and Akiko at the fence. And she remembered the moment when she understood that true courage was not about following the rules. True courage was about knowing when the rules were wrong and having the strength to break them anyway. That was the real story of what happened when American soldiers shared their rations with hungry Japanese children. It was not just a story about kindness. It was a story about a woman who learned that strength and compassion were not opposite qualities. They were the same thing, expressed through the willingness to sacrifice everything for what was right. And in the end, that woman, that brave, emotionally strong sergeant who had been mocked and underestimated and dismissed, became the model for exactly the kind of military leader and moral example that a nation needs. She didn't seek vindication, but she received it. She didn't seek fame, but it found her. And most importantly, she received the greatest reward any person can receive: the knowledge that her actions had made the world a little bit better, had changed lives, had planted seeds of compassion that would grow for generations. Sergeant Sarah Mitchell's journey proved that the greatest acts of courage often come from those who are told they are too weak to make a difference. And the greatest victories are won not through force and discipline and rigid adherence to rules, but through the simple, powerful act of choosing to be kind when it costs you everything. That was her legacy. That was her truth. And that was the reason why, decades later, the story of the American soldier who shared rations with hungry Japanese children was not just a nice story about kindness.